Welcome! We are going to take a look at how to set this up as quickly as possible, and we're going to learn what is it that we can do to learn when we've made a mistake. Pretend that we have installed something, remember, and then we try our hands without looking down on the keyboard and something happens. Now you look down and you wonder, oh my gosh, I think I hit Control and Spacebar. Double check the key binding that you had just done. Context toggle. That is a way to learn about your shortcuts. Oh yeah. Control U to make sure that this is what you want. Get ready. Hello, hi, hola, my handle and my greeting. Here we are downloading Blender 2.7.9, available at blender.org. Once you download Blender, you're allowed to install it, and on Microsoft Windows machines, you'll have to give it special permissions. You'll notice that the new installer has all sorts of weird bracketed little numbers talking about databases and files and old things and new things. I don't know what they mean, but it's an interesting new installer, and it has been pretty serious. I've already installed this on one computer. I'm doing it now on my big sharing computer. One thing that is helpful, well, you can certainly read all about Blender 2.8 after you download. It says, thanks for downloading Blender, but with an Amsterdamian accent. When you go to download, it detects the version of computer that you're using, your operating system. And that's really nice because some people might be intimidated by all of the versions and different options that are available. So before we get too far into that, I'm going to click Finish to exit the setup wizard. I'm going to open, for the first time, Blender 2.7.9, and we're going to talk about an initial setup, because for a fast workflow, there are things you can do to set it up to make it just the best tool for yourself. So let's begin. I should have just said let's get right into it, but I was still downloading, so I'm going to set a timer so I don't babble. Now, well, it's not really a timer, is it? It's a stopwatch. Got my coffee, got this, and we're set. 2.7.9. I can click this. If you're new to Blender, this is what you see. If you hit Alt F11, you go maximizing your screen so you don't have the taskbar up at the top. I don't care for the cube. I don't care for the viewport having a lens of 35, so I set it to 70. There's a reason for that, and maybe one day we'll talk about it. Nancy and Thomas are our two friends on the side here, and one way to make sure that they don't disrupt the middle view is, well, I guess we'll go right to that, is to enable region overlap in the system menu of user preferences. So now Nancy and Thomas don't jolt that center view. File, user preferences. Let's spend some time here. Let's begin with interface. Auto depth allows you to rotate around the object that your mouse is hovering over in perspective view. I like zooming to my mouse position instead of zooming into the middle no matter where the mouse is and then having to grab the screen with the shift button and mouse wheel click to get something into position. I like to zoom to the mouse position. I also like, in editing, more steps for the global undo. This is really handy if you're not efficient at grabbing vertices or edges en masse. If you're one of those people who will right-click select 60 vertices instead of some tricks for selecting those 60 vertices, you have eaten up 60 steps in your undo memory. So it helps to get better at selecting things or performing functions. It also helps to increase the number of steps in your global undo. I don't sculpt yet, so that's sad, but maybe some people do that. And they have tricks available. Input. I've really never messed with this. These, right-click select is the default, and there is actually a blog called Right-Click Select. It's based on a Blender's, right-click select. But you can change the way Blender orbits around objects this way. Add-ons. I did something interesting the other day, and I went through categories and enabled the add-ons that I like. And I'm going to make another video outlining some of these add-ons. And for the 3D view, what do I like? Layer management is something that will speed you right along. And adding curves, it's always good to have ivy and a sapling tree and some extra objects. Adding mesh, landscapes are helpful. I just started with Arcamesh, which is new for 2.7.9 as an add-on. It's an official add-on. It was not an official add-on prior. Arcapack, I just noticed. And extra objects. For animation, Animal. Animate pretty much everything. Camera, I don't do anything. Development, no thank you. Game engine, I'm not there yet. Import export, there are file formats that you may always download from the internet, like DXF and DXF and maybe you use GIMP. Wouldn't it be nice to import GIMP image to scene? Enable that. Images as planes, I pretty much couldn't live without. Lightwave objects are a popular way to share 3D files, so enable that one. And also virtual reality modeling landscape, good for augmented reality, virtual reality, 3D work, perspective work, conceptual work with architecture. Download that one because there's a lot that relies on that Vermal 2. I have not explored this. If you're curious about something, you can always drop down and click on the documentation tab and see what that group has linked to in terms of explaining about their add-on. So apparently this has been an add-on since 2.7. I've not enabled it and I've not watched the video, but if you create a dynamic sky, it looks as though you have all sorts of options here to do that. Sunlight direction really needs some work from someone. How to use it, etc., etc., I don't know. And I used, Alt-Tab to bring this back after losing it. So Dynamic Sky I will look at later. But I'll start using HDR images for a lot of things. Material Library. Click that. Just click it. Once we click it, these things are available and they don't waste the memory as we're using Blender. And so that's a really nice thing. Motion tracking, also not there yet, but would love to be. There's only one thing for Node, and it's Node Wrangler. When you're in categories and you click Node, Node Wrangler comes up. Do it. Just do it. I love Cell Fracture. I don't know what Cell Fracture Crackit is, but I know it won't hurt me to enable it. It has a dependency. Make sure to enable Object Cell Fracture. Well, I do anyway. Cell Fracture is really fun. Goofy, but fun. I used to do Cloud Generator. I may get back to that sometime. I recommend it. It's good stuff. Paint, I don't think I do anything with Paint. Pie menu, I just don't use the pie menu. Render, and copy settings. Look at all these things, That's why it's easier to go through categories and give yourself kind of a mental break of what is available. Under rigging, there's something called Rigify. I know a lot of people couldn't live without that. And you may get there one day, and you may download something that requests you have Rigify enabled. So go ahead and do that. The sequencer. I've never even used the sequencer. I have no idea what Kino Raw. I could look into that sometime. And for the system, this looks like some pretty intriguing stuff. I like developer stuff. I read through a couple of those, but I never used them. Texture Atlas is something a lot of people use. You can click the documentation and see what it's all about, if it's right for you. But if you're a new user just trying to find a good workflow, this may be, well, one, it's awfully dry, but this might be a little over your head. It looks like there's some good documentation. I love when there's a video that's not just 36 seconds and it explains how to use it or what it's used for. And that's That's generous. So Texture Atlas does look pretty clever. I've never used it before, but I'm going to click it. Why not? I don't change my theme. Some people get bored with the regular theme and they want to change to a different preset here, but I've just never bothered. Default plus sounds not like default. And in File, I like to auto-run my Python scripts. And in System, we already changed region overlap. Most importantly, I want to switch to a CUDA compute device because it's available. And that allows me to change something later. And I'm going, I think, to call that it. All I have to do is exit. I don't have to click Save User Settings. It's nice that it's available, but I don't have to do it. So I do know a couple of things. I do know that if I hit Control and the left arrow 5 times, I do know that if I hit Control and the left arrow 5 times, I get to the UV editing layout. The UV editing layout has its own Nancy Thomas, and I just don't like seeing them there. But this Nancy will allow me to change the lens on this viewport here, and so I will do that. Nancy Thomas is N and T on your keyboard, so now Control and right arrow 5 times gets us back to the main 3D viewport. Let's tackle this. From Blender Render, which is slowly being deprecated, to Cycles Render, that's a good keeper, we have changed to a CUDA device, which means it makes sense to change to our GPU device. That was easy. That's enabled once we change to a CUDA device. There are some other nifty things here. Output, the default, is PNG, color with alpha, 8-bit, and some mild compression. Take out the compression, switch to 16-bit. We're not using 8-bit anymore. And every once in a while I talk about why not. Our sampling, just to move things along as I'm working with something new, I lower those 35 and 10. When I need them to be more, I can just make them more. But oftentimes I just want to get into Blender and work as quickly as possible. Another way to make sure that Blender works as quickly as possible is to lower the light paths. Transparency, hardly ever use it when I'm making something new. Bounces, I want to left click and drag down, and entering a number will allow me to change those fields. All these three guys, whoops, all these three guys here, come on, one more, come on, come on. There's 3. I click in 4 and enter. I turn off the caustics for reflectivity and the caustics for refractivity because I can turn them on later. This is all about what's fast as soon as you turn Blender on. I changed these to 1. I meant to change these to 0. And the reason being, well, like I said, I just want them work quick. I want to see some basic shadows and just a basic idea of where things are relative to the camera. So those are light paths. Performance is an interesting one. It always defaults to 64 by 64. One way to make sure your render happens as fast as possible is to make sure that your X and Y's are some proportional measure of your final resolution. So I'm going to do math right in here, and I'm going to change my 64, which matches 1920. So I'm going to say 1920 divided by 4, I think is what I do. And the y is 1080 divided by 4. So I don't have to even do the math. Here's a quick note. If you did not have CUDA capability for the compute device, and you could not activate GPU compute because there's no little CUDA monsters on your graphics card, then you want to have these numbers even smaller. The graphics card enjoys, as the tiles, because you see that's what these are, they enjoy a larger piece of real estate, and they do better, faster, with larger real estate. your central processing unit prefers nibbles. It's more of a wine sipper out in the field painted by Monet, and it's a beautiful luncheon experience, and it's just nibble, nibble, nibble. So 64 would be good if your final resolution were based on 640 by 640. If I were just using CPU, I would divide this again by 4. And one way to do that, if you're using your CPU, is to take your final resolution and divide by 4, and divide by 4. And you'll get the correct number. So I couldn't have told you that 68 was 1/8 of 1080. But I want 1080 divided by 4. And I also want 1920 divided by 4. Just take my word for it. CPUs like smaller bytes, GPUs like larger bytes. Okay, did that. Start resolution has to do with the 3D view that we're looking at now. There's no rendering going on. There's nothing like that going on. The start resolution is when I hit Shift Z, that initial start, how was the resolution that it tried to accommodate? If you say 64, you'll get these big bitey byte, big chunky block, like 8-bit block things, which makes it start quickly, but it makes rotating the viewport kind of annoying. I happen to have a decent video card that can handle 512, but a 128 or even a 256 might benefit your machine when it comes to quickly visualizing and rotating around objects. I'm going to leave it at 256. Okay, good. We're moving right along. Film, if it's transparent, then your environment will be transparent in a final render. And transparency is portrayed as little squares everywhere. Oh, and Texture Atlas. How clever. I've never enabled that, so there's an option for it right there I didn't know about. Geometry, volume sampling. We don't worry about volume sampling because we're not using volume as an initial item. I like certain passes. So if I create a cube and I render that cube and I want to see the passes, I want to see different things. I want to see if there's any mist. I might be curious about the normal. I also want to see a specific pass for the shadow and the ambient occlusion. So now, if I render that same cube, I don't just get depth. I get all of these other little important things that might be relevant depending on the project, but I don't have to look at them. And it's not a big waste of time to enable those and never go through them. So since this is all about optimization, enable them. You don't ever have to use them, but they're there if you need them because those passes can be used in our compositing area, which has a Nancy that I don't want. And this is camera perspective. Let me just double check if this is cute the way I want it. Okay. That's compositing. I drop down and return to the default layout. And to save what I've done so far in the user preferences and also on my layout right here, I hit Control U. And it says, do you want to save the startup file? Yes. I want Blender 279 to always open like this, although honestly I really don't like that square. Cube. So I hit Control U and acknowledge that again. So let's quit it and come back in. Yeah. This looks so familiar. It's even on the last tab or panel or whatever we were looking at. Let's move over again. We've already talked about Filmic. I have not changed the folder, replaced the color management folder. And what's interesting is there seems to be no need. Once you've installed Filmic, it looks as though it gets in there. Let me double check that. It's in there. Okay. Gravity I don't mess with. Audio I really have rarely used, but I'm getting heavier into it. So I only double checked that Filmic was active because this was not set to Filmic before. Now the world I want to click Use Nodes, and for my preference, I start out with a sky texture. And there's Hosey Wilkie and Preetham. You just have to use your own, whatever you're in the mood for. The light, I enjoy the light also using nodes, having a size of 0.02, so shadows are sharper, and instead of just a color, I prefer black body at 578 as a strength. Oh, no, as a temperature, pardon me. As a strength, you can just dip it down to 1, man. Not 100. That's a whole lot of sun. Oh, it's not even sun. Bing, sun. Ha ha ha. That's what that's there for. Okay, deselect that, and then I just stick it on this tab. I will pull this until the slider above, boop, disappears. You see that little thing disappear? Good. Now I know it's a good size. I will use my mouse wheel and roll in to the time to the timeline here, and just because it starts out kind of small, and I'm pretty much set. Now when I open, I think that's right. Oh no, one more thing, my manipulator widget. When you have an object, you have the manipulator widget. And here's an example of auto depth. See, I have my mouse over the cube and I rotated. Now if I have my mouse over the camera, I mouse wheel and drag, it kind of rotates around the camera. So that's the auto depth that we enabled in user preferences. I also zoom into the mouse. I love zooming into the mouse. It's such a waste of time not zooming into the mouse. Shift mouse wheel or decimal to recenter. This is called the manipulator widget, and its controls are down here, a 3D manipulator widget. Did you know you can hold the shift button and left click select additional, what are they called? Transform manipulators, so they're all available all the time. If you don't know the keyboard shortcuts like G and R and RR and S, then you would like to have these available so you can constrain rotation to the XYZ, or constrain grabbing or scaling to the XYZ. I think those things are invaluable, so I like to have them always available on a global setting. Blender allows border rendering. I like to have that on as well, so that when we're looking through the camera and hit Shift-Z to render the scene, it only renders what's inside the camera border. So obviously, if we hit F12 to render, it renders what was inside the camera border. Now, what about this? What about Shift-Z to return to our previous view? What about Control-B to redraw that border? Now what happens if I hit F12? Dun, dun, dun! It allows me to preview a strip instead of the entire camera frame. That's really handy because this allows you to increase your samples, not waste time rendering things you didn't want to see in the first place, and when you go back and hit Control-Alt-B, it disables any border that you drew, because Control-B makes the border happen. Mind you, this little test strip that I just rendered, this only happens when you're in camera view, looking through the viewport. If I were to try that here, Control-B, and just do like this corner, it only remembers the border I drew in the camera view. That might take you some tweaking, but if I hit Control-B, the old one doesn't go away. If I hit Control-B, the old one doesn't go away. If I hit Alt-B, I didn't expect that. If I hit Alt-B, something really weird happens, and it stretches out to infinity. How about that? If I hit Alt-B, it allows me to work on just a portion of my model. Well, you caught me surprised right there. What just happened? How cool. I'm scanning very quickly on the side here. Select. What is Alt-B? I'll have to look that up. One way to look up a weird keystroke is to go under User Preferences and look at, is it Input? Yeah. It's Input, I think. And, oh my gosh, in the 3D view, I did Alt-B. Maybe I could do a search for it. I'm not sure how to do a search for it. Alt B. And window, screen. Now I'm gonna have to find it, right? Blender, name, key binding. Alt, how do they do this? Space, B. Clipping border in the 3D view. Clear the render border is Control Alt B, which was what I was getting at. Alright, I have a problem where some of my hotkeys don't work. This is where you could fix them. This input portion of the user preferences is very powerful, so I would suggest not tinkering with it. But if you've made a mistake like I just did, or something unexpected happens, come on in, remember the key binding that you had done, and you don't have to use a plus sign, you don't have to use square brackets. You can type in the thing you did, and then since I was in 3D view, Alt-B is a clipping border. I could deactivate that phenomenon, but I kind of want to keep it now that I know what it is. And I'm not going to change anything, or I'm not going to exit it. I'm not going to turn it into a tweak. I'm just going to learn what it is. And now I know that if I want to clear it and my render border, you know what, let's see if it renders. It renders the entire object. So this clipping is only for the 3D view. Control Alt B. Oh, that's Alt B again. Ah! All right, now that one made sense. Control B is this render border. Control B just redraws it. All right, so Control. Anyway, yes. Well, there you go. Now you've set up Blender. Remember to remove any geometry that you don't want to see, and Shift C is the hotkey to go ahead and take a look at everything. This has been very enlightening. I'm going to hit Control U, and con felicidad.